Welcome to another journey with the Gospel according to John. Last week we considered Jesus' self-understanding that he was God's son, meaning that his will and God's will were aligned with each other. And you might remember that the summary was threefold. First of all, that Jesus is not God. Jesus is God's spiritual son. And secondly, in Jesus we experience God. And thirdly, Jesus is God's messenger to the world. Now, as that is established, John, in putting together the Gospel according to John, follows this in chapter 6, in which the author first makes the case for Jesus being God's son by sharing another sign. Remember, the first sign was turning water into wine at the wedding. This sign is the feeding of the 5,000, and the story is well told often and more at times than I need to repeat it here. The interesting thing is, this story is also found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a miracle. So this is the only sign or / miracle of Jesus that is included in all four of the Gospels. Now, the story ends with an interesting reference in chapter 6, verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountains by himself. So at this point, people were really taken by Jesus, believing he was the Messiah, the king that would rule. Now, it's important to remember in the Hebrew library, we have two strains of thought. One is the establishment, and that the Hebrew establishment believed in kingship, in nationhood, and the temple as the place where God resides. But the prophets, the preachers, they contested that understanding of the judgment, of this understanding of the establishment. And they claimed that the community of faith was to be a servant community within every nation, rather than a nation having a king. And so the Hebrew prophets believed that this kingship thing was a bad course of action. And Jesus, according to the Gospel, according to John, he agreed with the Old Testament prophets. No, a king is not what the people need. And so he aligned himself, as he always did, with the prophets and the message of the prophets, rather than the message of the establishment. So he went in hiding. He went to the mountains. He didn't want to be heralded and captured into kingship. And then verses 16 to 34 tells of his reappearance, not as a king, not as a physical leader, but as a spiritual leader walking on the water. Lord over the physical elements, not a king over a nation. You see, the contrast is clear. Jesus is a spiritual leader, revealing God's love, not a king over a nation. Now, a dialogue takes place after Jesus sort of reappears, and they find him on the other shore, and he's over there. And then Jesus started talking to the disciples and teaching them the difference between physical food that they had just experienced in the feeding of the 5,000 and food for the spiritual realm of life. Just as the body needs physical food to sustain physical life, the spiritual realm of human existence also needs to be fed. Then in verse 35, the author quotes Jesus saying, "I am the bread of life." This is the second "I am" saying, and there are several in the Gospel according to John, but this one, "I am the bread of life," Jesus' self-understanding is that he is God's gift of food for humanity to be sustained in the spiritual journey of life. Now, in verse 40, Jesus again states so clearly that Jesus is the spiritual bread of life, enabling humanity to experience eternal life now. Remember, John the Mystic, believing that the experience of divine love is being engulfed by divine love. It cannot be explained. It can't be, it can't be described or defined. It's the experience of being engulfed by divine love. And Jesus states his own self-understanding that as the spiritual bread of life, this enables people to experience and be sustained in eternal life now. Now, we can never forget in the Gospel according to John that the context of the whole book is John 1. The Word was from the beginning, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And Jesus is saying that I am that flesh that dwells among us, and my message and my will is eternal life, being engulfed by God's love. Now, Jesus, God's messenger to the world, and verses 41 to 59 are often are referred to as the institution of the sacrament of the Eucharist in the church. Now, Eucharist literally means thanksgiving, commonly referred to today as Holy Communion, okay? Now, the other accounts of the institution of Holy Communion in the other Gospels are always at the end of Jesus' life, at the Last Supper. And this is the season of Lent, and we concentrate on the meaning of the Last Supper as the institution of the sacrament of Holy Communion. Not so with John. You see, as we said 3 weeks ago, John doesn't give a hoot about chronology. John is communicating what the Christ event means, not a chronology of Jesus' life and teachings. And John offers Jesus as the spiritual living bread that all humans need to sustain eternal life, being engulfed by God's love. Jesus says, verse 51, I am the living bread, spiritual food that sustains one in the journey of faith. The Word has become flesh, And the Word is the sustaining food, the bread. The Eucharist, Holy Communion, for John is not to remember or commemorate the Last Supper. It is an experience of thanksgiving, of being engulfed by divine love, which sustains humans in the journey of eternal life. Now, this understanding of communion is different than the commemoration of the Last Supper. They're really different. I've experienced communion hundreds of times, probably close to 1,000 because of the office I hold in the church. And it really always has bothered me when communion is serious and somber and sort of the Last Supper kind of thing, that Jesus is going to die. And that's where John is really helpful to me in saying the institution of the Eucharist is on the basis of the saying that I am the bread of life, and all of a sudden it becomes an experience of joy and an experience of thanksgiving. Again, the mystic who believes that the spiritual dimension of human existence, which is beyond the human intellect, that spiritual dimension must be fed. And Jesus is the bread and the sustenance for eternal life now. And in this understanding of Holy Communion, it's a time of joy and it's a time of thanksgiving, not a somber time of remembrance. Now, in response to this dialogue about Jesus being the bread of life and what spiritual bread is all about, his followers were confused. And we read at the end of this chapter that most of the followers left Jesus, and Jesus confronted the disciples. He said, "Do you really believe? And are you willing to follow me?" And Peter responded that, of course they would follow him. And Jesus said, "Oh, to some extent, but one of you is going to betray me." You see, a clear message of John as he puts together his message that Jesus' life was not going to be a rose garden. For even one of the disciples would turn against Jesus, the Word that became flesh, the spiritual bread of human existence. People were turning away. Only the disciples remained, and Jesus said, "One of you will betray me." A lot to think about, isn't it? Just a couple questions for our thought and discussion. First of all, what is our experience, your experience, and my experience of being spiritually bred by being fortified by the Christ event? Let me ask it again. What is our experience of being spiritually fed, fortified by the Christ event? Another question. How does John's understanding of Jesus being the spiritual bread of life give meaning to the celebration of Holy Communion in our own community of faith? And then another question, let me add. It's a fact that attendance on announced Communion Sunday is always a bit lower than the average attendance of any congregation. So my question is, why do many believers avoid the experience of Holy Communion in many churches today? A lot to think about. Enjoy.